Tell me a little bit about what you and your colleagues hypothesized in terms of math and talking to kids about math. What did you want to find out?
We wanted to understand just kind of how parents talk about math with their young kids, especially kids who, the math skills that we in the sample had 5 and 6-year-olds, the types of math skills that kids this young are really thinking about and how they're thinking about math. And particularly, we don't know much about what parents do with their kids to help them learn math. We have a ton of research on how parents read to their kids, teach letters and things like that. So we really just wanted to see how much do parents even talk about math? Do they use number words when they're playing? And how much does the use of those number words help kids learn math potentially? So we gave them, we never told them that the task that we had them play with toys, and we never told them it was about math. We never asked them to talk about math. So we just wanted to see in a natural environment, what do parents bring to the conversation?
Tell me how you went about doing that. You had a special lab set up?
Yeah, so we had 46 children who were 5 and 6 years old come to the lab with their parents, and we gave all kids the same toys to play with. And we intentionally tried to choose things that could provoke math talk, could provoke conversations about number, but didn't necessarily. So we had some blocks that had numbers on them, but also had shapes and letters. We had some pretend food and a cash register. So some people would use that and make themselves breakfast or lunch, and other people would play store and talk about how much things cost. And so we had them play with the toys for 10 minutes and basically told them, have at it, play what you want to play with, have fun, play as you normally would at home. And we were video recording them and then went back later and we transcribed everything that the parents and the kids said to each other. And we basically just counted how many times did they use number words and what numbers are they saying, both the parents and the kids.
And what did you find?
So what we found is, well, one, there is a ton of variability. Some parents are using number words all the time. They're having these really complex conversations about cost and adding and, if we purchase these 3 items, what's our total and how much change am I going to get back? Other parents really never talked about math at all, so didn't use number words, outside of maybe saying 1, 2, and 3 a few times. And what we found when we went and looked at the parents who were using more number words, those kids tended to have higher math scores too. So right after this, we gave kids a math assessment where, they had to do the types of things that 5 and 6-year-olds can do with math, counting, doing some simple sums and simple subtraction. And the kids whose parents had used more number words, and particularly used more of those big number words, so numbers more than 10, those kids tended to have higher math scores.
You had mentioned the bigger numbers. Mm-hmm. Why is that important, Leanne?
Well, so there's some earlier research with kids that were, I believe, 3 or 4, and they found that it's numbers larger than 3. So hearing parents talk about large numbers, how they thought about it was 3 or numbers 4, 5, 6, and above. That might help kids because it's kind of outside of the range of what they already know really well. And so for our sample that was a little bit older, we were thinking about, numbers that most kids by the time they are 5 can count to 10. And they can work with those numbers really well. And so what about when parents kind of challenge their kids a little bit, talk about concepts that might be a little bit more outside of the range that kids are comfortable with to see if maybe that extra exposure is beneficial for kids.
You said that they had different kinds of things they played with. Could you describe again?
So they had a cash register and some pretend food. We gave them pencil or colored pencils and paper in case they just wanted to draw or write anything down. They had a couple books that they could play with or they could read together, pretend food and dishes and cups that they could play with. And then we also had a boat game that they could play with where they could balance different pieces on a boat. And we thought maybe parents might talk about spatial concepts or, some kind of basic geometry with young kids. But what we found was really that it's this number talk or this talk about objects. And the interesting thing was that parents would talk about numbers even when they were playing with things that weren't necessarily about numbers. We have one book about emotions, and parents would count the number of characters in the stories and things like that. So it's not just, playing a game that involves math, like playing store, but it was really just that parents would use number words across all the different tasks we had, all the different toys.
So it's actually using the numbers, according to your research, that made the difference.
Yeah, so it looks like it's the parents that use numbers, and we're doing some follow-up studies now with younger kids to see what that actually looks like, where if you're using number words when you're playing a board game, it's kind of built into the activity, but then also looking at how do parents use number words just in everyday interactions, when they're waiting for the bus, when they're at the store, when they're interacting with their kids in more informal settings. And what we think is that regardless of when you hear numbers, it's going to be helpful for kids learning.
What are the implications?
I think the big thing and kind of the motivation behind a lot of this research is that we really don't know much about math, aside from the fact, or about how parents talk about math, aside from the fact that they don't do it as much as they do reading, right? So parents tend to prioritize reading and language skills over math, and a lot of parents are actually kind of unsure about how they even should incorporate math. And so for us, the big kind of recommendation to parents and the take home is just that talking about math, incorporating it into day-to-day interactions can be really helpful. At least that's what the research we're doing is starting to suggest, that any way that you can have those conversations might be beneficial for kids.
Could you give me a couple of your top suggestions of the best ways for parents to start to incorporate this math talk?
We've done some other work where we've interviewed parents and some of the ways that they talk about, potentially incorporating math information. I think whatever comes natural to parents and whatever they're comfortable with is really useful. Other things that parents will talk about is ways that they can make it into a routine, right? So every morning, if you're waiting for the bus, if you have a routine, like I know one parent that we had talked to in the past mentioned, we count how many red cars go by, right? Simple things like that. That you can do in any place, in any location, that kind of makes math a pervasive part of kids' days. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the research is looking now, is how do parents talk about math in the grocery store, right? So when they're just shopping with their kids, can you talk about how much things cost, or talk about how many items are in your cart, or just these basic kind of small interactions that don't take much time, but just take kind of remembering that it's important.
Is it important for parents to get above the number 10 when they're counting?
I think it's just responding to what kids know, right? So if in our study for 5 to 6 year olds, it was those numbers that were larger than 10. But we've also have some studies and some work looking with younger kids, and it turns out they don't have to be as large of numbers, right? So it's something where you're maybe pushing kids slightly above their comfort zone, slightly above what they already know. But I think it comes down to kind of knowing what skills children have and working with them at that level.
How about at home, in the living room, when it's playtime? Are there certain games or certain toys that lend themselves to those numbers and that number talk?
One thing that a lot of research has looked at and really highlights the importance of is board games, and especially board games where you're moving along. You move forward certain numbers of spaces or backwards, can be really helpful for kids understanding how numbers are related to each other. And so things like board games and card games, any games where number is really a big part of the task at hand, right? You need to know those numbers in order to play the games. Seems like they can be really beneficial for kids' skills.
You're not talking about flashcards or memorization.
Nope, so just things like Uno, where you have to kind of recognize numbers and understand what they mean. And kind of the guiding idea behind a lot of our research is that these activities can be fun, and we think at least might be even more beneficial if they are fun and they're kind of part of the everyday activities.
You had mentioned next steps and next studies. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so one thing that we're just starting to analyze some of the data now is we have a study with 3 and 4 year olds. And so we do the same exact task where we have them come into the lab and we see what they play with, or how they play with the toys, how they talk about math. And then we also are video recording the parents when they're at home. And so for this, we do actually all through Skype calls or some sort of video conference, and we tell the parents, play as you guys normally would, not just with the toys we've set up with, but with whatever you have on hand at home, to get a more naturalistic sense of, you're not in this new environment, you're in your own living room, and presumably probably more comfortable too. And so we're trying to see if, certain parents, how they think about different activities, and whether are the parents talking more about number, or are they doing different activities at home, and what kind of characteristics of that home environment that might be a little bit more, variable and chaotic than what we see when kids come into the lab here, how those different factors and what's going on at home might relate to kids' learning.
And what's the long-range benefit of improving math talk, especially at these early ages?
So what's actually surprising to some people is that there's research showing that math skills are actually one of the stronger predictors of kids' later academic achievement. So reading is obviously really important when kids start school, right? You go from this learning to read to reading to learn. So those early skills are obviously so important. But I think people overlook the importance of these foundational math skills too when kids start school. And so if, number talk might help kids get kind of have higher skills at the starting gate when they start school, which is what our research is at least starting to suggest, that could be a really promising outlet for helping kids kind of on the long run with school success.
What was your undergraduate in?
University of Delaware, and I have a bachelor's in psychology and cognitive science. I guess also I have my master's from University of Pittsburgh.
And what was your master's in?
Psychology, so a few years ago on the way to getting a PhD.
Do you specialize in pediatrics?
And young children and in education.